So, good evening and welcome to History on Your Doorstep on Bro Radio with me, Graham Loveluck-Edwards. In tonight's programme, we're going to be talking about the insurrection that was going on in Wales during the 19th century. I say Wales, I'm talking very specifically on our doorstep in the sort of South Wales area, because we had a string of it kicking off over here. Starting with the Merthyr Rising in 1831, then we had the Rebecca Riots kicking off in 1839 to 1844, and of course we had the Chartist Revolt as well in 1839. So within quite a tight space of time, the people of South Wales, as I say, really rising up, really turning against the authorities. Now, as always, I can't possibly handle a subject like this all by myself. So I'm delighted to introduce you to an old friend of mine, Mark Lawson-Jones. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Graham. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, mate. And you?
Very, very good. On a sunny day. Excellent.
It is. Listener, on the day we are recording this, it is absolutely sweltering, may I just say. and we can't leave the fans on because it makes too much noise. So, yeah, we're just coping. We're suffering for our art here. And now it's your turn. So, yeah, so those of you who recognise Mark's name, you will probably recognise him from the Little Book of Wales, which we were just discussing just off air a moment ago. When did that first come out, Mark?
Well, it was 2012, and
was it
I
really?
very much enjoyed writing it. Writing down all the things that I felt I should have known about Wales. But when I grew up in the 70s, the history of Wales and many of the topics weren't on the timetable. So it gave me the chance to, on my day off from my day job, as it were, to learn more about the place that I call home and the place I love and still do. It was really a notebook in a sense, everything from Chartism to pot noodles, facts for everybody. I think they'd call it a coffee table book, but yeah, I really enjoyed it. I updated it last year, and it became Waterstone's Book of the Month, Welsh Book of the Month in April. Absolutely delighted. And I just hope that whether people are visiting Wales or Welsh people who wish they could engage a little bit more, see this as a non-academic tome, but something they can pick up and learn some stories about the place they love so much.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that jumped out at me is you talk early on in your introduction as to why you were writing about it, is that you discovered that in this school where you weren't really taught that much about local Welsh history, the Chartists actually physically marched past that actual school. So I mean, it's just I mean, this is something I hear time and time again. Unfortunately, it is being addressed now, but only now that schools traditionally haven't picked up on our incredible history here, and it's only now the curriculum's changed that kids have to learn about Welsh history and Wales's place in the world and things like that. So long overdue. Absolutely. I think we're all agreed. So
absolutely.
Well, I was hoping that in tonight's show we could pick through the different things that were going on in this period in history. So we're going really back to the 1830s, where there must have been something bubbling below the surface for all the things to have happened here in South Wales. I mentioned earlier the earliest of these things, like the Merthyr Rising, for example. I mean, what in your mind was what was driving this, which was taking people to the point of rebellion where they were prepared to strike and rise up against the authorities?
I think it was the perfect storm, Graham, to be absolutely honest. I think things were changing to the whole of UK, really, with industrialisation and whole communities changing. But in Wales, particular things happened that gave a background to a very, very unhappy nation. The new Poor Law of 1834 had reduced welfare payments and forcing people to enter workhouses with hugely harsh conditions. And this is to the backdrop of the industrialization, as I spoke of the economy, and it created these overcrowded and unsanitary urban areas, low wages, insecure employment, but also the health hazards. People were dying a lot younger because of injuries and illnesses they'd received from this difficult and dangerous work. And then when they found themselves unwell, There was nothing they could do. It was the workhouse, really. And there was no government intervention. Around this time, it was the
Yeah.
abolition of slavery in the British Empire, as was. But still in Wales, children were working in the mines and the ironworks, and people were being paid tokens instead of cash, and they had to spend these tokens in the company shop. So Wales and the Welsh people were feeling particularly out on a limb. There was no real government intervention, no public health, and no education services for so many. And then at
Yeah.
the end of this, there was a sense of frustration as high tolls were imposed on the roads, and transportation and trade got very, very expensive.
And that spread it out of the industrialized areas into the rural areas as well.
It did
So
indeed, yes.
absolutely. Well, picking up on what you were saying earlier, about the sort of living conditions that people were forced to live in. I've got here an account written by a chap called William Henry Duncan in 1830, and he was a
Mm,
philanthropist and a doctor, and he travelled through what we would describe as slums, really. But he went through the parts of Britain where people were living in the most unbelievably squalid conditions, and he's just to pick from what he describes as the sort of conditions that people lived in. So in his view, roughly a third of the population lived in the cellars of back-to-back courthouses. He described them as having earth floors and no ventilation or sanitation, with as many as 16 people living in just one room. These conditions were predisposed to the spread of epidemic disease, in particular cholera, right up
mm.
until the mid-20th century. This was not a place for the faint-hearted. So we've got such atrocious conditions to live in that
Yes,
you wouldn't
yes,
want to live in at the best of times. Also, there was the threat of disease and what that could bring. And then
yes.
if you were lucky enough to be in work, you were being paid with a means that you could only spend in the shops and pubs that were owned by your employers. So
Absolutely.
what's different about that? How is that different from slavery? That is, where's the
Well,
difference? Where's the driving line?
well, exactly. The questions that the Welsh people were asking sort of came to the fore in the rebellions and the risings and the riots, but they were really watching the rich, who many of them had moved to Wales with their
Mhm.
families in grand stately homes, many rooms, windows, and
Yeah,
decorations and gardens, while the poor lived in those huts or cottages, or even in some parts of the valleys, roughly hewn caves in the
yeah,
hills, close to ironworks and the pit. There was
yeah,
no occasion for joy, really. And then that moved on to education. So Welsh people had little or no formal education, those who were working. Um, and I see the sense of this at the moment with the role in which I work. I'm in London at the moment, and there's a library at which I work in, and it's in a place where we store all the treasures. And I made a comment on my first day when I was being introduced to in Wales. We didn't see libraries as places where we stored rare documents and treasures. They were they were places to give freedom to the working people, and virtually no leisure time for
yeah.
those who worked with the exploitation, I'm going to call it, the slavery, indentured labor, and the fact that their lives were worth nothing. They were numbers.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
on my soapbox now, Graham. I'm so
I
sorry.
know, I
You-
know. I somehow got you on there. I'm delighted to hear it. We'd be marching on the palaces of the mighty before anyone could turn around and stop us.
we
Um,
will, we will.
we also, I mean, you mentioned then about the have and the have-nots and the great disparity. And I guess nowhere was that more clear than in Merthyr Tydfil, which is where the first place where it all really kicked off during the uprising, because you had the immense wealth of the ironmasters, the Crauchetes, who had built their own castle, looking down onto the town that was spread below them, where you had all this incredible poverty and deprivation going on. So it's not really that much of a surprise that on the 30th of May, and it always tends to be, this is why I wanted to do this show in June. It's usually sort of May, June time is when
Mm.
when it all kicks off. So So yeah, 30th of May, 1831, the Merthyr Rising begin. I mean, what's your knowledge of kind of what went on there? What happened?
I'd not thought of the early summer risings. That's
Oh
a very
yeah, it's all
interesting.
part of it.
Apart from the Chartists, we're doing all right with that. But you're
Oh
right.
yeah, because they're November.
Yeah. Well, Crawshay had a very interesting thing. You know, when it became almost impossible to pay tokens, he decided he'd create debt amongst the workers. So not only was there low pay, there was debt, credit at the shops, and appalling working conditions in the ironworks
Mm,
and mines in the town. And then uh, it was already a hotbed, Merthyr, of political unrest and rebellion. A strong rebellion broke out after Crawshay attempted to cut the wages when they were already struggling. And, you know, there were problems with alcoholism because of the pressures, and children weren't being fed, you know, and
mm.
relationships were strained in the whole of the town. And the workers rose up against the British government. Uh, in May and in June, it went on for some time. And it's believed it was the first time the red flag of revolution was flown as a symbol of workers' revolt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true, but I like to think, you know, that started in Wales.
We're
That's
going to
good.
take a short break right here, but we'll be coming back shortly to talk a little bit more about what went on in Merthyr and also what went on elsewhere in Wales around about this time, because it wasn't isolated to Merthyr Tydfil, it's happening all over the place. So in the first part of the show, we talked a little bit about the conditions that working people were living in. And the contrast between that and the vast wealth that was being accumulated by the ironmasters and the pit owners and the industrialists, really, at that time. We also talked a little bit about the first of the major rebellions in this area, being the Merthyr Rising. And we talked about basically how it started and how that being where we believe the first time the red flag was ever waved by workers turning against the bourgeoisie, as it were. Now,
Mm.
I use the word bourgeoisie as a little bit of a clue. There was another reason why we were having these revolts, and it wasn't just because the conditions were as bad as they were. It was also because those dreadful conditions, which were in other places as well, wasn't just in Wales, had led to the birth of new political stratas. So, for example, between 1760 and 1825, we had a chap in France called Claude-Henri de Rouvroy, who was the Comte de Saint-Simon. And I've been looking forward to saying that all day. So he was a French aristocrat, and he is credited really with having created socialism, given birth to socialism, as it were. And his work was picked up by other people like Robert Owen and William Lovett, and they were basically writing manifestos and works saying, look,
Mm.
this cannot go on. This is unacceptable that people have to live and work in these sort of conditions. So
Yes.
so what you said before the break, absolutely spot on. This was a perfect storm. There were lots of things coming together that said that now is the time for us to do something about this and to stand up.
So yes, this is education, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
the Welsh people in the valleys who work in 50, 60 hours a week had heard about this French social philosopher, uh, one of the founders, the great founders of socialism, and he believed that the productive class, the
Mhm.
industrialists, scientists, and workers should step down, really, uh, to basically understand that the workers were actually the only ones making anything of any value. He said that priests, nobles, and lawyers should be eliminated. I don't know about that, but
What?
and he also proposed a new religion of humanity that would celebrate progress, human progress. Um, it, you know, he wrote so much. There's almost something for everybody in there, really.
Yeah.
But with Robert Owen's sort of more descriptive examples of what he wanted to happen. He wanted to organize workers into utopian communities, that would support each other and share wealth, be self-educated and radical, and move humanity as they saw it into a next more equitable, just and fair phase, where the people who earned the profits kept the profits,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, correct. So what sort of things was Robert Owen proposing? What were his solutions for the world in front of us?
Well, both Robert Owen and William Lovett shared the same common goals and principles: democracy, cooperation, education, humanism, but they also had some distinct differences in their strategies of how to get there. Owen was more visionary and idealistic, while Lovett was more practical, in many ways. Owen favoured these new communities, these egalitarian communities, supporting the people to keep the wages they had and concentrating on education and health. And Lovett sought to reform society through political action, direct and indirect. And Owen had a great influence abroad, especially in America, where his ideas really did take off. I don't know what would happen today, but
No,
it
of course.
um, while Lovett had a greater influence at home, especially in London, where so many of these ideas were fertilized and took form. For 100 years before, great thinkers and philosophers would come to London to meet those who've been uh, fleeing for their lives from places like Italy, and all these forums just were created, and philosophy, and this is the crucible of socialism, really.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and then through education and the workers' associations, it spread to the people, who are the object of this, those who are working and dying for the profit of others. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So when it came to because you mentioned about democracy being one of the things that was seen to be, as something that was required, what was the state of democracy at this time? Who had the vote and who didn't?
Well, at that time, and before, really, very, very few people, rich landowners, were able to vote and sit in Parliament, and really, it was everybody you knew. It was your
Yeah,
club. Uh,
yeah.
People that you may have gone to school with, or your relatives might have married into the family of. There were no surprises. They were completely monocultural, and also monoclass.
Mm.
They enjoyed the same wealth and the same benefits, which were defended ruthlessly. So, in a sense, we called it democracy, but it was just a tyranny, really.
Quite a long way off it. And of course, these people, when they rose up in Merthyr, they had to face down infantrymen and soldiers firing live rounds at them and trying to, the way they
Yeah.
tried to suppress this uprising, they brought the infantry down from Brecon to fire on people who were taking part in the revolt. And that's why on Crochet's grave it says, "May God have mercy on his soul," because the number of
Mm.
people who died at the heavy-handed way he tried to bring the revolt to an end. But it wasn't isolated to Merthyr Tydfil, and even if you step outside the industrialist areas, one of the more surprising places where a revolt should begin is on the border between Cardiganshire and Pembrokeshire, which you'd normally think of that as being quite a sort of peaceful part of the world, really. But
I know, yeah.
it
Yeah.
always comes as a shock to me that. But yeah, so what we had there is a lot of the issues that were being experienced in the industrial parts of South Wales. In other words, low wages, high rents, very little autonomy about your life. You're totally at the whim of your employers and your landowners, confounded by a run of bad harvests at the beginning of the century, which meant grinding rural poverty. And on top of all of that, you had to pay to use the principal roads that took you anywhere that was worthwhile going to. And if you were a farmer and you needed to take your livestock to market, the cost of doing so, particularly when you didn't have much money to start with, was starting to get absolutely ridiculous. So all the way over, in Carmarthenshire in 1839,
Hmm.
June 1839. So I'm backing
No.
I'm backing my thing about it being a summertime thing. That's when the Rebecca Riots all happened. Now, they were pretty colourful events, the Rebecca Riots. I mean, there was a lot of violence, but also an awful lot of pantomime as well that went into the Rebecca Riots. Why would they call the Rebecca Riots? Do you know?
Yes. Well, just before I go on to that,
Oh,
you
okay.
mentioned about the tolls. You know,
Yes.
that we had that as well, but there were the taxes, the poor relief, county rates,
Yes.
church rates,
Yeah.
custom
Yeah.
duties. So it was a bit like, what tax is coming next, and
Yeah.
um, and then unfortunately there were the tithes that were paid to the Church of England, because there was no church in Wales then. It was the Church of England. A tenth of the annual produce or income went to the local parish, and this meant so many Welsh people were
Wow.
nonconformists. They attended their own
Yeah.
chapelty in the church, so they weren't just rebelling against the government and the landowners; it was the church as well. And yeah, it's a full house almost, isn't it? It really,
Everything.
really is.
I think. I think. I
Yeah,
think now
sorry.
is a good time to tell the boys and girls who you work for.
Ah, well, yeah, I'm an ordained priest from the church in Wales, and I've had a long and interesting journey, and my current journey leaves me with the title of Deputy Chief of Staff to the Archbishop of Canterbury. I work in Lambeth Palace.
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. So he's not some lefty having a go at the church. He's talking from the inside.
I am talking from the inside, and you can just imagine the trouble that I cause in Lambeth. Uh, well, the Rebecca Riots, June 1839, to 44, so at the length of the Second World War,
Yeah,
but 100 years before, of course.
yeah,
The protests, the local farmers, as a response to the levels of taxation. So not just the tolls, the tithes, and all the other things. And the rioters, men often dressed as women, took their name from the biblical figure Rebecca, uh, a symbol of female strength and determination. And but many of the Rebecca incidents, they've been painted as the toll booths and the turnpikes and things like that. But they were about the general economic conditions as well.
yeah,
I think in some novels that have been written, we see it's all about attacking the toll booths and taking the
yeah.
taxation away. But it was a long and established campaign by men dressed as women who were taking back control, taking back wealth. And just like in the Merthyr Rising, those whom they owed debts to, they were breaking into company houses and ripping up debt books. So there would be no record of what was left. And yeah, it's fantastic, really. And Rebecca's daughters carried on until 1844, and I think it's a fantastic and using that appearance of Rebecca as that symbol of female strength
Yeah, yeah.
and opposition. Rebecca, I think it comes from Genesis, and where it says, and they blessed Rebecca and said unto her, Thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands and millions. Let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them. And this is the verse they shouted, There's
I've
everything
not
in the
heard that
Bible
before. That's
for every
fantastic.
occasion. It's great, isn't it? It really, really is. But
I had no idea. I always understood that there was that the significance was that women are traveling alone. You were allowed to pass through a toll gate without paying if you were a woman traveling by herself. And also, my
ah,
understanding, so that was part of it. The other thing was, of course, there were big burly men in dresses. So there's a sense of irony that they would call themselves Rebecca, as the Old Testament character was meant to be so stunningly beautiful. So there was meant to be a little bit of tongue in cheek about that at the time. That was my understanding. I totally loved the bit that you just came. I've never heard that before, and that's absolutely fantastic. As we know, the whole thing kicked off on the border between Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire. But, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I'm always interested to find a tenuous local link.
It's a tenuous local link.
So, yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to that stage. where I found a tenuous local link, and it refers to towards the latter part of the rebellion when it had started to move out of Carmarthenshire and into the hinterlands of Glamorgan. So at the time this was happening, there was no police force in Carmarthenshire. So all the police that were sent to deal with the rioters were sent from Glamorgan. And when the trouble started to spill over, it happened on the 6th of September in 1843, when a crowd of 100 descended onto the Pont de Dylais area near Swansea, and the Chief Constable Charles Napier of the Glamorgan Constabulary had been tipped off to expect trouble. And so he lay in wait with his own men and a battalion of infantry. There were some shots fired, 7 people were arrested, and they were tried at the Cardiff Assizes. 2 ringleaders were identified, both Glamorgan men, and their names were John Jones and David Davis, both at the time living in Pontarberlin. So they were sentenced to 7 years of transportation at the trial. And the more I learn about these 2 people, the more I cannot believe that they were friends, but apparently they were. So John Jones was originally from Merthyr, and his friends in Merthyr described him as a heavy drinker. So I think he was a heavy drinker. After a few years of labouring in the copper works at Pontarberlin, he became a soldier, and then after he left the army, for a period, we think up until the time of the riots, he made his living as a prize fighter. So we get an idea of what sort of person we're dealing with here.
I've got a picture.
Yes, well, his partner in crime, David Davis, was born in Llancarvan, here in the Vale of Glamorgan.
It's a tenuous local link.
So that's where our tenuous local link was. He was originally a farm labourer. Unlike Jones, he was not a drunkard nor a fighter. In fact, from what we know about him, he was quite artistic. He wrote poetry. He was also a lay preacher in the Wesleyan chapel. So what these 2 had in common, what these 2 people, what brought them together? Insurrection is what brought them together. Some kind of political motivation to rise up. But yeah, so even though this part of Glamorgan wasn't that well represented at any of these moments of insurrection, we still managed to send people to play a wage, ladies and gentlemen. We still had people playing there to do their bit. So the Rebecca Riots, go on.
No, I was going to say it's the best example I've heard for a long time of my enemy's enemy is my friend. You know?
Very good. Yeah, good point. Very good point. They carried on until 1844, and they kind of ended because, well, partly because there was an inquiry into what had been going on, but mainly because railways had taken over from the roads monopoly. It was now much cheaper to move people and goods around on trains than on roads, so their time had kind of elapsed anyway. So there we go. You've got 2 examples there straight away of things that had kind of boiled over in Wales. The first, the Merthyr Rising, much more in the industrial heartland of the country. The second, the Rebecca Riots, most of it taking place in rural, really rural areas. So we've been talking about Welsh insurrection in the 1830s and 40s, and what it was that drove so many people in South Wales to rise up against authority.
It's amazing what happened in Llancarvan. But
always,
you know, the Merthyr Rising and the Rebecca Riots, they caught the imagination of all working people really in Wales, whether they were from the rural agricultural economies or whether they were from the heavily industrialised towns.
Yeah.
But you know, history has written this that in the short term, very little was gained by those demonstrating against injustice and, in some cases, losing their lives and their livelihoods. But although the Merthyr Rising brought an end to the truck system, where people were paid in tokens rather than real money, taking away freedom or mobility, and of course the Rebecca Riots led to a reform of the toll gates. You know, some of that to do with the railways, but still they were reformed. But what we must never forget that history is a continuum, and the long-term effects of the action of these brave people
Yeah.
were far more profound and have
Yes.
echoed down the generations, really.
Yeah, yeah, and definitely, you know, we would be looking at the legacy of all of these things, because there are an awful lot of things that people today maybe take for granted that people had to die for them to earn, and I think nothing says that more than what happened through the Chartist movement and where we ended up with after that. So. Give us a little bit of a flavour of what the Chartist movement was and what it was all about.
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. We know it happened in Wales, like the other risings. People who write the history of the Chartists like it to be called not a revolt, but a rising,
Yeah,
because the words revolt and riot make it sound a little bit more illegal, and they believe a rising is a just rising against authority. But the backdrop to this wasn't just small insurrections around the nations, including the Luddites, but the Chartist Rising really was a movement that aimed to bring about political reform. And in the United Kingdom and in the early 19th century, it started to gain pace like an avalanche, really. And the movement was made up of working class people who demanded greater representation in Parliament. The Chartists had 6 main objectives: universal suffrage for all men over the age of 21, secret ballots, annual elections, equal representation in Parliament, payment for members of Parliament, so you could be a member of Parliament and not just a member of the old boys club, and the abolition of property qualifications for MPs. You needed to be a rich landowner to be an MP. At this stage, of course, it was universal suffrage for men over the age of 21, and less than a century later, women through the suffragette movement are taking on the authorities to gain that as well. And that's the backdrop of all this, really, in a national sense. But then on November the 4th, 1839, John Frost led a group of around 5,000 workers, a small army, to Newport in an attempt to free some political prisoners that they'd already taken as part of the national movement to win the vote for the working man, as it was.
yeah,
But when they arrived at Newport, they discovered that the authorities had made arrests, and they had several Chartists in the Westgate Hotel, and they marched and started chanting, "Surrender our prisoners." And the authorities refused to release them, and violence broke out. The Chartists were defeated by the army, the government forces, who'd come down from Monmouth, and many were arrested and imprisoned, and some were killed. Uh, we look at other nations who kill people who oppose democracy or challenge dictatorships, today, and we find it horrific. But we've got to remember that, less than 2 centuries ago, we were doing it within our own borders.
absolutely.
And these things created a sort of a sense of solidarity and joining together to share the good things in life of all the people that had lost so much. It wasn't good enough to be virtually enslaved in the valleys when you were working so hard for your family. And this sense of needing to grow out of the tragedy and the violence and the death of children in the pits and all these other things
Yeah,
really took on a life of its own, really. And, these little riots might have started with men in dresses and, things in the past, but the impact of these events on modern society, not just here, but around the world, is significant. The Chartist movement paved the way for the union movement, the labor movement, human and civil rights, the suffragette movement, democracy, and eventually, with the Representation of the People Act in 1918, there were secret ballots for all those over 21 and women over 30 who met certain qualifications, and it rolled on from there, giving people the more freedom to determine their own destiny.
yeah,
And subsequent legislation has moved things on, and it's something we hold so dear. We don't
yeah.
question now. But
And
a lot of it started here in Wales, and we
of
should be
course it
proud.
did. And also, I think people forget that it wasn't, we're only talking about 1839. It wasn't actually that long ago that, as much as we were saying earlier, if you're paid in tokens, you can only spend them at your employer's establishment. What's the difference between that and slavery? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that ordinary people did not have a vote. I mean, parking the fact that it took, another best part of another a fair amount of time before the women had the vote as well. But, as recently as that, the only people who were allowed to vote were landed gentry, and the only people you were allowed to vote for was landed gentry, because nobody else could afford to be an unpaid member of parliament. And as much as people bang on about how they think politicians are overpaid today and they're on a gravy train and all of that, from a sort of political point of view, the fact that they are paid is what makes it possible for ordinary people to represent ordinary people, which is what our democracy is meant to be about. And it all comes back to this. But like you say, the shocking thing is how the authorities try to prevent this from happening, try to prevent the Chartists from having their way and having everyone having a vote. It just seems incomprehensible today.
Well, it does, absolutely. And my grandfather was born in 1901, just before Queen Victoria died. And so in a sense, he was a Victorian, although we do say the Victorian era lasted till 1914, I suppose. But he remembers things like Welsh Not, and he was the penultimate child of 13. So his older brothers were alive in the 1880s, 1885, 1890. At the end of the era of Victoria's reign, in a sense. So within his memory, there would have been people talking about the Chartists, Chartist Rising. He, as a child, might have heard people talking about that. So, if for my family, it might well have been that my great-great-grandfather could have been there.
Yeah,
And
of course.
and when you say that, and then apply it to maybe my own children, and think about, well, what was my great-great-grandfather doing? It's not long at all. It's the span of a family history. And within the span of a family history, the Welsh were in indentured labor and enslaved, unable to have any mobility, denied education, and not just freedom, healthcare, and all these other things. And within that living memory of a family, we've come this far. It's and of course at the beginning, whether it was the Merthyr Rising, the Rebecca Riots, or the Chartist Rising, what they were doing, the authorities were shooting their own people. They were killing their own people.
Which we're quick enough to condemn when it happens abroad, but let's not forget that's how people in this country dealt with other people in this country who wanted everyone to have a vote.
Absolutely.
It's so amazing how that attitude ever prevailed. So why did it happen in Newport? Because there was obviously the incident in Petersfield in Manchester, and there were a few peppered around the place. But why was Newport the place where it all happened in well, not just Wales, for the southwest as well? Because people came from all over the place to march on Newport.
John Frost was a very interesting character, and after the Rising, he would have been executed were it not for the feeling that his death would have caused a whole fresh movement, for what they'd see as his martyrdom. Basically, he was an apprenticed woolen draper in Bristol, and then owned a shop in London, and he kept the Royal Oak Inn in Thomas Street. So he was well known, really, and his grandfather was a bootmaker, and he was apprenticed originally to a woolen draper in Bristol. So he was somebody that everybody knew. He had a political career, and he would have been before the rise of the internationally famous. He would have been famous in the area for his work and deeds. really.
Well, there were lots of people who I know came over from Bristol, because one of the things that there's a quite a famous chap who was the mayor of Bristol, called Charles Pinney, and he was sort of famous for inaction. So at the time when all the Chartists were meeting in Bristol, and they had these massive gatherings in 1831, and damage was done. They were described as rioting, and troops were sent for, but he wouldn't actually send them in to deal with the issue, because he was, and there's on the record, he contacted Westminster to ask for direction from the Home Secretary as to whether he should take action, whether he should send in troops, and the Home Secretary didn't want to get his hands dirty, so didn't reply. And he took the initiative to, well, that's probably a good idea then. Let's not get my hands dirty. Let's not do anything. So as much as the troops were stationed on the outskirts of Bristol, they didn't come in, they didn't open fire. So the trouble in Bristol was relatively short-lived.
Of course, yeah.
Because so when they were confronted in Wales with the way they were, people not just from Wales but also from the southwest came across as well to join in, and it did end up being a sort of mini revolt of the whole region, not just South Wales. You had people from all over the place joining in.
Yeah.
But for such a moderate set of demands, though, that's what's so ridiculous. You had to work so hard to get something which we now consider to be, well, a basic right that an awful lot of people can't even be bothered to exercise. That's what's so shocking, you know.
It is. I sound like a miserable old man saying people died for this vote that you're not using, and if you don't vote, you can't complain. But I know. Oh, there's an interesting fact about Pinney. He was sort of the man of inaction, but he was engaged to marry a woman who was the daughter of the slavery abolitionist William Wilberforce.
Right.
But Pinney had a family secret at the time, which was his family owned plantations in the West Indies with a huge amount of slaves. And I can just imagine the conversation one day, they're just about to get married, and he mentions about his family, the money he's bringing into the relationship is all based on slavery. And I can imagine Ms. Wilberforce, I don't know. It might not have happened like that.
It does sound like a difficult conversation. So where'd you earn your money then? I'm going to take it a fifth on that one.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah, he didn't, clearly, in a sense that he was so inactive he couldn't think up an excuse.
Yeah, but didn't even see his own marriage through. We can't really lose sight of the long-term effects of all of this insurrection.
Go to see the little random railway tracks on the top of a beautiful mountain. A dozen sheep and maybe a little building, a stone building, a lime kiln on the side of a canal. If you've ever been walking in the hills and you see something that looks like stables, these are links and histories to the past. Our industrial archaeology is insanely valuable, but it's something we never really talk about very much. But every time you see something like, think about the people who went before us, the people that put iron in all parts of the world to build railways, and basically drove the Industrial Revolution, and paid for it with their lives and the well-being of their families. And eventually, when they'd had enough, they didn't just hide away. They turned the democratic world on its head, and brought about a democracy that hopefully in as many nations as we can will bring about good conditions for everybody, regardless of birth and status. But go and see some of that industrial archaeology. You can Google it and just see what's around, and it's absolutely fascinating. It really is.
And look at it and realize how far we've come. So, ladies and gentlemen, well, that is all the time that we have. Mark, haven't seen you. Do you know what? I worked out. I think it's over 10 years since you and I have seen each other. So, quite apart from anything else, it's an absolute delight to see you again. But thank you ever
you
so
too,
much for
Graham.
coming on the show. Absolutely fantastic. And I hope both of our listeners have learnt a lot. So that's it from History on Your Doorstep. We'll be back again the fourth Monday of next month. I have not yet worked out what that's going to be on, but it'll be on something. You'll see. So thank you all very much for tuning in, and I'll see you all soon.